Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets battle, bury, almost lose, but ultimately come out with the win over the rematch with the Indiana Pacers. We break down, obviously, Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving's performances and why the rotations and complementary pieces of Yuta Watanabe, Joe Harris, and Royce O'Neal, to say nothing of Nicholas Claxton, were so critical in pulling out this win.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, Bill Jabiri, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I, of course, am Adam Armbrecht, covering the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack as we break down the New York football surging season all year long. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free on linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. And Doug, hello. How are you, sir? As the Brooklyn Nets managed to pull out the victory, we're obviously going to talk about it soup to nuts here, but behind the curtain, man, Doug came in wet and wild, fast and furious. Wasn't sure if he's going to make it. This was a mad dash to the finish line for you.
You never know. No, I thought I wasn't gonna be able to make this episode, but the tide turned. We were able to get to it. Nets won. That made it easier to get the motivation to get all the ducks in a row to be able to show up for the show. But yeah, Doug
was mostly focused on win or loss, and then also some contract negotiations. I've heard rumblings.
I don't think I can make it unless they win. But I'm pretty busy tonight unless they win. No, we had other stuff going on. Anyway, yeah, no, it's good. I'm glad to be able to jump on here because obviously this is a win they desperately needed. It should have been 2 in a row. I hate to throw any just sour stuff over this win, but you would have liked it to have been 2 games in a row here against a Pacers team who they fight hard, but the talent wise is considerably behind where the Nets are. Yep. But a win is a win, even if it looked a little closer than you wanted it to be. And even I was kind of wishing and praying on some possibility of a KD and Kyrie sit in the fourth and get a little rest on the front end of another back-to-back. But Nets can't have things like that in our lives. But all in all, W is a W, even if it's the Pacers. And it was really good to have things get quasi back on track here.
Yeah, Ben Simmons doesn't play in this one, dealing with some knee soreness. We'll discuss what looked different without him being on the floor and why it can still be viewed as a positive for the Brooklyn Nets going forward here. Obviously, at a high level, the Nets performed a lot better out of the gates, performed better through the first half, into the second half, and then in true Nets fashion, still tried to give it away here. I'll just briefly mention before we talk about the game flow in this one and how the Nets came out with a better energy, better focus, all those cliche words you want to throw out there. The final sequences in this one where they almost give this thing away involved a missed shot from Kevin Durant out on the wing, 2 missed perimeter shots from Kyrie Irving. I hate to do the thing where you say, as good as their games were, it looked like they were settling late in this one. But the best part of it was the closeout sequence when it's a kick to Kevin Durant, gets it back to Kyrie. He sees the lane open up. He goes and attacks, finishes at the rim. And that was essentially the dagger in this one as the Brooklyn Nets do win it 116-109. But when we back it up here just to the top, high level, this team came out with a lot of all of the things that we were getting frustrated by over the first 6 games. Essentially, they showed that, hey, they were at least mildly pissed off to have gotten beaten up by this Pacers team, even if they did stumble here in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, the energy was super live in the first quarter. It would really look like they wanted to come out and make a statement. Obviously, no Simmons in this one, no Seth Curry. We'll see what happens on those guys on the back end of the back-to-back. But the energy level for the first quarter, at least, was the highest I think we've seen all season. Flying around the court, wanted to get it after it on the defensive end, getting tons of great looks. I actually don't think the looks were that dissimilar to what we got last game when they kind of started splitting up the Claxton and Simmons minutes. These ones just went in, right?
Nor were the looks for the Pacers. They just didn't go in a lot of instances here.
And sometimes,
shooting.
Sometimes you can do all the analysis you want for about basketball and watch all the tape and whatever. And sometimes it does come down to just, are you making your threes or are you making your threes, right? And we saw these numbers almost completely flipped between the two teams, where the Pacers in the first game of the series, or the back-to-back, had shot like 50% from three at halftime, and the Nets were at something like 20% or 25%. And that number was really just like transposed almost exactly at halftime of this game. And definitely in the first quarter, where the Nets couldn't really miss anything. And look, sometimes those are going to go down and sometimes aren't. Now, when they are, you're going to jump out to a really big lead. I mean, they were up 33-18 at the end of the first quarter. It looked like they were going to kind of run away with it. And I think we were seeing, at times, the best version of what you think the Nets are going to become. The ball is moving, everyone, the ball is popping. It's kind of the opposite of what you mentioned a minute ago, the late game sequences, which kind of get, a little bogged down. Yep. I understand why those things happen. Like, that's not just the Nets. Other teams can be like this too. It's like easy to start defaulting to your best players because the best players want to score in big spots, and other, the role players want to let the best players score in big spots. That's why they're the best players. Like, that's
and the role players want to high five the stars after they make those shots at the end of games.
And yeah, like, not like anyone's shying away from it, but that's sort of the hierarchy of how basketball works. Is the best players take the big shots when it means the most. So I understand a little bit why it happened, but in the first quarter, and I think we saw this against the Pacers at times too in the first game, is that you saw when they can get spacing, when they're committed to ball movement, when they're committed to just continuing to move and just look for the next guy, that guy a lot of the times is there. And they just seem to sometimes not be able to sort of follow through and carry it through an entire game.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it there, looking for the next guy. That was the biggest part of the first quarter, and really it bled throughout this game for large chunks. And that's what I also thought was important, just having the consistency of go back to the repetition of what you want to accomplish offensively. Keep looking to provide those easy opportunities for teammates, and everybody continue to go on the second to the third pass, right? Draw the defensive matchup, provide the first kick, and usually, this is just a universal truth of basketball, getting the defense to have to shift from one side of the court to the other is usually how you create openings, whether it's attacking towards the basket or getting wide open looks for guys on the perimeter. And honestly, when you look at the box score, nobody was lights out from the outside. So you can again go back to this well and say, good outside looks, but without Seth Curry, obviously. You did have Joe Harris in this one, but he did a different version that we'll get to later of his game. The looks, it wasn't, 2 of 5 for Durant, 2 of 6 for O'Neal, 4 of 11 for Irving. Nobody was knocking down a wild amount of perimeter shots. And quite frankly, they only took 30. And I say only because by NBA standards, that's going to be back half of the NBA on a per game average basis. But the movement was there and the intention was there. And I think that's the big difference just from what we've seen to start this season versus this game specifically. And you even said maybe we saw glimpses of it, and it's kind of hard to squint and see it when they get beat by the Pacers in the first one. But this is what you anticipate. Good movement and transition, but then thoughtfulness with your passes. I think too much early in the season, it's been, yes, getting out and running, but then getting the ball into either Kevin Durant's hands and saying, now you go do something, or as we've discussed, Ben Simmons kind of bogging down that offensive rhythm, and then all of a sudden it stagnates, and maybe we're getting away from what we think the coaching staff's principles are coming into the season.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. I think that, there are going to be times, I think just because of who they have in this team, there are going to be times where the Nets offense looks brilliant, right? Like it can't not. When you have Kyrie Irving and KD on a team, like it'd be impossible to, at least for some stretches, not look completely amazing on offense. And like I said before, and I think you were getting to as well, is that when the commitment is there to that brand of basketball, to like look, to try to get back over to the weak side as much as possible, right? Like, especially when people throw doubles at KD, which they did, they blitzed them to some degree in this game. Trying to get all the way back to the weak side is usually going to work if you can get all the way there. They sometimes feel committed to doing that and sometimes not. When they're committed to getting slip stuff for Claxton, who I'm sure we're going to talk about Claxton here, but when they were, getting slipped into him and get him to read and react out of those short rolls, like they're going to find shots. He missed a couple of those looks, but in general, when those are there, we see like sort of how the offense can roll. It's just that for whatever reason, I don't know if it's because they don't have like a good all the time facilitator like Harden used to be, right? Like Harden was an all the time facilitator. Like he never stopped facilitating the offense. Even if you didn't love Harden's game or not like him, as a player or whatever, you can't deny that when he was on the court, it was a constant battle in his mind of trying to find the right, the right read,
Yep.
right? Like the right matchup, the right guy to get the ball to, the right time to drive himself, all this stuff. The Nets still don't have a guy like that. And it's still very obvious. And this is why that consistency around the ball movement and the playmaking as a team, I think will probably always be a struggle, honestly. I think it will always be something of a struggle just with this personnel because they just don't really have a guy to keep that flow always going, right? And I think the dream was it would be Simmons. I think sometimes it is, but not enough and so far. And so I think that's why whatever you want to call it, stagnation, like lack of focus on what they were trying to do, a version of it that looks worse than what we see from the beginning of this game. I do think it's about that connection piece that they just don't have a player that always has that kind of thing in their mind.
Yeah, and that's the difference between, and as you said, we'll touch on Kevin Durant's game here and then some of these key role players and the overall. So there's really good themes in this game from a lot of these key positions, but ultimately, Kevin Durant, like you say, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, even if they're the second recipient of a pass, their first thought is not to continue that feed along. And I'm not going to, I'm not going to single out the two best players on the team and say they're not passing enough. But
no, this isn't a knock on those guys.
Yeah,
it's not a knock on those guys. It's a team level kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's the give and take of the ball movement, which ultimately ends up rewarding your best players by giving them easier access and easier shots. So I think you're 100% accurate about that. Now it's about, can the Nets find those guys within this roster that will push that tempo? And we'll talk about some of the other big takeaways from this one next.
All right, first, we're going to tell you about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You got to be 100% certain you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team. Here are the words you want to hear: faster and for free. All you got to do is use that hashtag hiring purple frame in your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it super easy to find and focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and then ultimately hire, because that's the goal. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. It's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
And of course, friends, we always say we thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen today, why don't you go ahead and check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. From the games that matter most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only the Locked On Network can provide. Locked On Sports Today is available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. Okay, so the other thing is here, I just want to at a high level, Kevin Durant's game. So we were talking about it where because the Nets lose, Kevin Durant only having 4 shots in the last matchup early against the Pacers, you go, well, that's a problem. And I was talking with Tony East from Locked On Pacers the other day, and Jackson Gatlin. I've really done a tour on the network.
In the rounds, baby.
Of late. You better believe it. And they're all very appreciative.
No one calls me.
but when we talked about it, it was like, is that a problem? You go, well, when they lose a game, yes, but in theory, you like the idea that the Nets were winning that game at the half without Kevin Durant having to do as much.
I loved it. Yeah.
The only thing I like more than that is when Kevin Durant comes out firing on all cylinders to start a game and he finishes with 36. And even more than that, something that I think is also becoming a theme, at least early in the season here. We talked about it with Kyrie Irving and his focus on the defensive end, just trying to be that pest, trying to be an irritant. Kevin Durant, likewise, man, there's nothing sweeter than watching him block Miles Turner going at the basket as everyone is clamoring for him to be the rim protector for Brooklyn. No. Kevin Durant is that rim protector. There's just a really good focus on Kevin Durant on both ends of the floor, I thought, in this one that carried throughout. There was never a letdown from him, never a lull. Something that at times, when it comes to frustration and early struggles in the season, I can almost understand star-level players having that. None of that in this one for Kevin Durant.
Yeah, I did think there was just sort of around that. Sometimes people say, your defense kind of stokes your offense, right? Yep. Like if you're kind of flying around in defense and you have a lot of intensity there, it's going to do a couple of things. One, it just means you're sort of just locked in. You're locked in on whatever it is that you need to be for that game. Also, just two, getting defensive stops and specifically blocks and even better steals is going to spark a transition game, which this team is always going to want to be out in, right? Most teams are going to want to be out in transition. This team is especially going to want to be out in transition because they don't have the same size as some of these other squads. So when they're able to finally win a defensive battle, or even frankly, even get a defensive rebound, because at times that's even a struggle for them. When they're able to do those things, they really, more than a lot of other teams, have to take full advantage of it in transition, right? They have to be able to, and when you have guys like KD and Kyrie, who are two of the best at it in the game, like then even more do you have to take advantage of those situations. So when you see guys like Kyrie and KD getting after it defensively, which I'll be honest with you, for the most, Kyrie for sure the whole season, like he's been,
he's been pretty locked in,
basically locked in on defense the whole season, like just getting after it all the time, making up for whatever size he gives away, and he's really kind of always been like this. And then honestly, I mean Durant too. Durant, do you know he ranks 5th in the league right now in blocks per game? Did you realize this? Like he's been getting a lot of these weak side blocks now, because they don't have tons of defensive presence. They've needed to bring him into the interior even more, because they need him sort of like quasi weak side rim protecting.
And Rick Carlisle protecting, because he almost threw him to the ground running up the court there.
Well, that was Carlisle's fault. Yeah, that was Carlisle's fault. So but you're seeing this, like this is how it's sort of manifesting, is that they do need a lot from these guys. They're often thought of as offensive first guys, but they are two-way in the sense that the effort is pretty consistently there. I mean, maybe Durant's had a few kind of lapses, but for the most part, it's been really, really good. And I think, this is kind of what you're driving at, right? Is like this idea of what they're kind of doing on both ends.
Yeah, and I think because you go back over the life cycle of the Brooklyn Nets with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, we've always known what the offensive game has been, right? We've never had any concerns about that. We always know it can be electric, but we also know that this team struggles defensively, struggles to get stops, struggles to have an identity. And to your point, not only can your defense be the engine for your offense, but your superstars' defensive effort can be the engine for the entire team, the focus, the drive for everyone. And just to highlight that a little bit further, first of all, I just want to make sure that we make mention of Kyrie Irving. In addition to his 28 points, he gave you 6 trips to the line, knocked them all down, usually always does, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, 4 steals in this one, as well as a block. And he even got one on a goal. It was a goaltending call, but the effort was there trying to get the block.
Oh man, that looks so close to not being a goaltend. I know that it was, and he didn't put up a fight, but he really got up on that. Like,
the fact that he was able to be over top of I think it was Duarte going to the rim there. I mean, he was over the top of him with plenty of room.
It doesn't matter.
But either way, he was there and it was beautiful. And I'll take the goaltending on that.
One more thing about the blocks and steals, just real quick, and then you can finish your point. But on the season, the Nets averaged 15.2 blocks plus steals. Like that's okay. They were number 1 in the league in blocks going into this game. But they had 20 tonight. So just even that alone, a 30% increase on, or 33% increase on what they were already doing, which is actually decent. On the defensive end, to be able to pile on a few more stats. Some of that's pace related. But anyway, just kind of want to throw that in there, that they were piling these up.
Yeah. And so the other point that I just wanted to make, because you mentioned about the weak side help defense from Kevin Durant. In years past and in general, we always say, well, what you'd like to do is have more length and have more size and keep pushing Kevin Durant towards the 3 spot, right? Give him the easier defensive assignments. However, his length in and of itself, especially as a secondary defensive contributor in those sequences, I think that's where you're really seeing the dividends, because the ask isn't go down into the low block and play physical against Miles Turner. The ask is, as Nicholas Claxton takes on that assignment, or as Yuta Watanabe was switching down into those sequences when he was on the court tonight, when Royce O'Neal is playing up on a defensive assignment. Okay, let them handle the physicality there. Your role is to be timely, get yourself in underneath the basket, because what do we lack? We still lack some length. We still lack some size on the interior. Your length alone has value disrupting second chance opportunities and trying to get some of those defensive boards. So, is this sustainable for 82 games for Kevin Durant? Probably not, but this is a much better version of what you want to do defensively. Same way we talked about Kyrie Irving coming in. There seems these last couple of games, well, there's been an active intention about him getting some defensive rebounds, right? Other guys working on boxing out, and let your guard come in and get there. So I think there is functionality to these superstars that they do need to do on the defensive end until you find the rhythm and continuity from other players. Maybe until Ben Simmons really cements what his role and feels comfortable, because this is primarily his function and what he needs to be doing defensively, right? And that's why these guys shouldn't have to do it every single game.
And this is the dream of Ben Simmons. And this is the dream of a $40 million a year Ben Simmons, is that all these things that we just talked about, right? The connector, someone that can pick out different mismatches, that someone that can read and react really quickly, someone that can pick up primary defensive assignments, someone that can take the defensive load off of some of these other guys. basically 1 through 4 or maybe 1 through 5, depending on what the other team is doing. Those are all, that is the description of Simmons right there. Like that is the description of the best version of him. We've seen it only briefly at times. We have not seen it like fully all the way through. But I think, for those things at times it has been there. I mean, everyone's going to focus on the shots he doesn't take. And I think that's a fair criticism. And it's not going to help his case at all that like they won this game without him there. Like if you were looking for reasons that Ben Simmons shouldn't be on the team, like this game's going to, in some ways, tell you all you need to see. I would still definitely push back on that. But in general, what we've talked, and I would actually push back on it because of what we just said. All the things that we said the Nets kind of need on a consistent basis, even a lesser version of him still does almost all of those things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the version of the team without him cannot sustain what they're accomplishing in this particular game. The sample size is not something you say, let's go back to that well for 65 plus games.
I hate to make it about Simmons who didn't play here, but and we'll move on because I definitely want to talk about Claxton. But think about like, would you in the end, it's sometimes very easy. Would you rather have 15 minutes of Edmund Sumner or 15 minutes of Ben Simmons? I know some people are going to say Sumner here because they look like a shot out of a cannon. In general, in the NBA, you still want Simmons, right? Like you want Markieff Morris here for 15 minutes. Like just start replacing these minutes. Like start replacing some of the minutes that these other guys played. I still think the answer is Simmons, with the hope that like there's even more upside on his game than these other guys ever can have. Like the other guys do not have the upside at all. Like they have some floor in terms of their skills, but no real upside. Simmons is the one that does. He just hasn't really shown it yet. But in general, just let put a pin on it. That what those skills that we were looking to describe, he is the one that actually has all those.
And coming up here in a second, we'll talk about a guy that maybe has at least a ceiling that could start sniffing the air of where Ben Simmons we think could live. And that's one Nicholas Claxton. We're also going to highlight Joe Harris in this one, along with Yuta Watanabe, and just what the sample size we got in this game from a rotation standpoint that I think matters as Ben Simmons gets back out there on the court off of his sore knee. Okay, so obviously, let's just first and foremost here, because we had a couple of quiet games from Nicholas Claxton over the last couple, and we said it was disappointing to see that because you want to feel like, again, that his floor is rising, and on a night-to-night, game-to-game basis, you're going to say, this is what we get from Claxton with consistency. This was a back to what we've loved early in the season from him, the first 4 games, not the last 2, and that was just a guy that plays the floor in space incredibly well, runs with efficiency, does all the little things correctly, is really starting to show that connection fostered with Kevin Durant when they're out there in transition as well. The gather is there, 9 of 11 from the field. We know it's all around the rim. We know he did a great job, picked up 4 assists in this one too. So the secondary passes we're talking about, everything you want to accomplish, it has to carry over to both ends of the floor and carry from the superstars down to the last man that comes in the rotation. I thought Claxton with 4 blocks in this game. He challenged the bigger matchup. I screamed it over on social media because I'm a psychopath. Nicholas Claxton better than Miles Turner. And guess what, though? What I'll tell you is off in this game, and just my general principles on Nicholas Claxton, this is why I don't feel compelled to trade for a Miles Turner. Not because they're the same player, not because they do the same things, and not because Miles Turner isn't good, but because Nicholas Claxton shows you that he can continue to grow and he can continue to be an impact player night in, night out. I loved everything about his game. I'll never back down. Jack Reacher, never back down.
I would, I'll step in and say I would still want Miles Turner on the team.
So I would take him on the team, but I would never take him at the sacrifice of Nicholas Claxton.
Gotcha. Okay. I probably would. But anyway, but in general, this is all going to be pro Claxton here. Yeah. So I think it was very obvious the second Simmons was ruled out that we were going to see a lot of minutes from Claxton just in this one, just because what we've seen leading up to this was the continued insistence on not playing these guys together past the opening sequences, right? Like they're starting the Nets are in a weirdly unfortunate situation where Simmons and Claxton are among the 5 best players on the team, and they just don't exactly fit together, right? And it's a weird spot to be because it's like, well, who don't you start, right? It's pretty clear maybe that the fit isn't correct together, but it's hard to decide which one heads to the bench, right?
Let me interject here with this one, because I think off of the way Nicholas Claxton has looked early, and we know he has familiarity, I could make the case not about who's the better player, the better pure talent, but that the better move here might be to try to bring Ben Simmons along with the second unit and just allow that first unit to have the continuity early here. Now, The drawback is you need Ben Simmons to get the continuity with the best players, obviously, but just I'd rather see everybody in the starting unit tonight, which when you win a game is usually the case, plus, right? All the way down the line, including Claxton, a plus 17. Like, I want the best starting five out there, especially early in the year. And then we want to work our other guys along. Like, I don't think it's a terrible idea to say Ben Simmons coming off your injury, a lot of time away from basketball. It's okay if you get your reps with that second unit, and I can make a case for a nice complementary set that you could put around him there.
Yeah, I think it's just a tough spot. I don't have a definitive thought on that. I can see the merit in all of it because I think what you can see is that when they're separated, the versions are still pretty good. Like with the
Yes.
Simmons plus spacers last game was, I thought, very good. The shots just didn't go down. Claxton here, obviously, I was setting some minutes projections for this one, nailed Claxton's at 31, and that's exactly what he ended up playing. But because it was like, if you follow what the team is doing, this is pretty obvious. Like, he's going to play a lot of these minutes. It's not anti-Claxton or anti-Simmons. They just don't want to play them together for long stretches. This matchup also worked out a little better for him because Indiana does trend bigger across the back line. I mean, if they're going to start Turner and Jalen Smith, or if they're going to start Jalen Smith and Isaiah Jackson, these guys, you see a little O'Shea Brissett at times, Goga Batadze, like, they're pretty big. Like, this is a pretty big team. So it was going to make sense that the Nets were going to have to play their biggest player, or effectively their best big, right? And that's what Claxton is. And he was totally up for it, man. I mean, he was definitely 19-9. He had a ton of emotion in here. A couple just yaks where he just looked like he wanted to pull the entire rim down. Some of them were the easiest things ever, but that's great. Like, he was definitely, those are the things that I do think actually give him, a guy like him, like, tons of confidence as the game goes on, because he's like, if I can get the easy ones, then the harder ones look a little easier, right? And this is and just I think we are going to end up comparing Claxton to Simmons at times, because I think this will be a question. They're definitely not the same player, but one doesn't necessarily beget the other, and I think this will kind of become a weird problem for the Nets going on. And because it's almost like what Simmons doesn't do. It's like Claxton, I think, does have a ton of confidence, has gained a ton of confidence. Just think about how his finishing at the rim has improved over the last couple of years. His decision-making has improved over the last couple of years immensely. I mean, it was really rough to start. And that's just slowly going away. Less mistakes, less kind of fumbling the ball, less indecision, more going up strong. And this game actually kind of like capitalized on a lot of those things that we've seen him get better at, because he was very, very confident in this one.
And I'm going to say, too, because we've seen that over the start of this season, that Nicholas Claxton, that confidence is something that you actually can visibly track throughout the course of the game. And when he's feeling himself, there is a correlation to his production level on the court when it's a quiet set of time. And then you talk about this crossover when Ben Simmons is on the floor. I feel like when he's not involved, it's a more difficult task. Because, by the way, this is what we talk about, right? Well, Nicholas Claxton put in all the heavy lifting effort on the defensive end and maybe don't get rewarded offensively, right? Like, we know everybody wants to put the ball through the bucket. Everybody wants to be able to grimace and run up the court, pumping your chest and getting high fives when you come off after timeout. So I think that reward is really important. The other thing that I do want to touch on here, just in terms of these rotations, is when the numbers don't work out for us, we ignore them, like Yuta Watanabe being a minus 16. Now, that's mostly because he's on the court when the Pacers are having their absolutely epic run. It wasn't because of him. I thought his defensive work was quality. Likewise for Joe Harris in the starting unit. Joe Harris, his line where he only took 2 3-point attempts and knocked one down, but 3 of 6 from the field, had 2 assists, 3 steals, and a block. Like, do I expect him to be able to do that kind of game and that type of stat line every single night? No, but I said it when he first came back to start the season. I thought he looked a little bit more nimble and a little more spry. For whatever that value is, it's important that as a backcourt player, Joe Harris is one of the biggest ones you have available for you. So that was really important to see him play well also. On Watanabe, I think this is the sequences that we're talking about, where you start to think about Ben Simmons, you start to think about Claxton, and separating them. What is this other unit going to look like? And this is where I think the Ben Simmons with a Yuta Watanabe, maybe it makes sense to have Joe Harris get into that second unit, let Seth Curry play in a slightly bigger first unit, or vice versa. But all of a sudden, if a facilitator is what we think Ben Simmons can be on the offensive end and a table setter, these guys are showing up in consistent enough way here early, and maybe Subner can be a part of this. It was okay tonight, did get to the line, which is something he's been able to do. you can start to envision a second unit where there is flexibility. And I think that was the big goal here. There's a lot of risk here around injuries with Sumner, TJ Warren, guys like Yuta Watanabe, who hadn't had as big a role. But you can look at the offseason moves and say, okay, you can see, as we talked about, the duplication and redundancies of skill sets. They've created the redundancies. Now it's about placing them together in the right order. I don't think they've figured it out yet, but you're starting to see those glimpses. So again, it's the Indiana Pacers, but
I still think like a Simmons plus Harris, Curry, O'Neal, and then like Yuta Watanabe.
Yes,
Watanabe.
Yep. That's
like
good. I didn't know where I want to go with the five.
Yeah,
but
that 5-man unit will score points.
Yep.
And it'll probably get just enough stops in the defensive end against another team's second unit that as long as the other team isn't running like a huge rim running big, right? Mm-hmm. Anything short of that, or like an Embiid or something like that, but they would never do that against that lineup. So, but really most lineups in the NBA, most second units in the NBA, if you were running that lineup, which is Simmons plus 4 shooters and, or 4 just enough shooters, right? Yeah. Royce O'Neal, it's just enough 3-and-D. I think Yuta Watanabe can shoot just well enough. Guy's got a ton of confidence, which I really like too. His confidence is probably higher than his actual skills, which I'm always for.
Yeah, you always want those guys
to be
always want irrationally confident, as you
always
would say.
Want that guy. Always want a guy whose confidence is higher than his skill rather than the reverse, because you can just see the differences. It's almost like Edmund Sumner. I think actually he's faster than his basketball skills. I've gotten the sense that like he can run faster than he can actually do things at basketball. I love that though, because
and very quickly, like Tony East, when I talked with him, he said he's like, from a ball handler, maybe a little point guard work, he's like, this guy can do it. And he literally is going so fast that sometimes he's ahead of himself.
He can't dribble fast enough for how fast he can run. I mean, that's very simple. He just can't. He cannot dribble a basketball because he's like, it seems like Olympic style fast. He cannot run fast enough. Excuse me. He can't dribble fast enough to actually, put it all together. Anyway, point being, with the Simmons piece, when you get defensive games like this from Harris, you're like, okay, well, now he's going to be able to hold it up on both ends. That's great. Right. Yep. Like then you have guys that are just at least competent defenders. We already know Royce O'Neal can do it too. If you put those guys around Simmons, you will generate offense. Like, and again, we'll harp on this all season long because they have to get to those lineups eventually. Like they have to be able to get to those lineups for 7 minutes a game or something like that. Not much, but like something of no KD and Kyrie. But yeah. So anyway, I think we're starting to see glimpses of it. Again, wonder
the Pacers.
Wonder what it does for Simmons that they win with this game and he doesn't play, because I do worry about these things with him a little bit, just because I think that he is a guy that thinks about this stuff, but hopefully he comes back in the second game against Chicago and they were able to kind of put up a full team effort, because I think you got enough to draw on from this one.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. There's definitely enough positives here to make you feel a little bit less disgusted by the first loss against the Pacers. As we said, we're waiting for that 15 to 20 game sample size, and let's be clear here too. They almost blew it, right? Let's just, if you had some little pit of your stomach kind of vibe where they were closing the gap there, they tied it at 100 here in this fourth quarter. And you did go, and even at that in and of itself was enough to be like, well, I'm not fully satisfied about what we did here, but 30 games from now, we won't look back at anything other than the fact that they beat the Pacers in that second game. And we
just
move
like
on.
A loss is a loss. They're all like the game against Dallas. We already forgot that went to overtime, right? We've already forgot that was an overtime loss because it's a loss, right? Yep. So like you just get few games removed. You'll forget how you won. It'll just matter that you got the W. Okay. Thanks for everyone that jumped into YouTube. We're going to close out the regular podcast here. We got a bunch of people asking questions in YouTube, so we'll try to pull a few of those up before we get out of here. In the meantime, if you're listening on the podcast, make sure that you are subscribed to YouTube so you can get all these notifications when we're going live after every single game. So make sure you subscribe over on YouTube, and then subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast too. Just make sure you're getting all that stuff for free, because that's how we bring it to you.
You better believe it. And hey, we're trying to stay positive in the early days of this season. And I think dogs are the most amazing creatures. They give unconditional love. For me, they are the role model for being alive. Gilda Radner.
Oh, R.I.P. One of the all-time greats. We will be all-time great poets. Sorry. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
I don't know what I want to do, Doug, for the post podcast. It's something. It may be jazz hands. I'm not entirely sure, but I'll figure it out. Bottom line is, as we always say, thank you for everybody that came in and enjoyed this one. Hopefully you felt a little bit better coming off of a win. Obviously it wasn't perfect. We did footnote there at the end. They tried to blow it, but they managed to pull it out. And that's all that's going to matter. If you have a question or a comment, fire it off with @LockedOnNets. This will probably be a little bit of a briefer one here.
Yeah.
Doug doing just the hero's lift, making the journey. You don't realize that he's actually sitting in a Texaco parking lot right now, and they're asking for him to start pumping gas in a minute. So we will go.
I'm honestly sitting in an Airbnb, and that's why I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it tonight. So that's why the background looks different. That's why everything looks a little bit off. The lighting's worse because it's an Airbnb, and that's where we are for the next couple of nights. But you know what? We get the kids to bed, and we make sure we
talk hoops. We talk hoops, brother. That's what we do.
That's what happens.
I will just footnote because we did talk about it. We're not going to speak on anything beyond it, but I'll just say that there is a sense of what's going to happen as far as Kyrie Irving and his comments and everything that went on over the last couple of days. He did take that post down on social media. There does seem to be a sense of internal conversation that wants to go on to the Nets organization. We'll report it if it comes up. There was a presence around anti-Semitism right in the front row, right next to the Pacers bench. So this isn't going. We said it wasn't going to go away. I was somewhat surprised that it did seem to go away right as you got to this game. To take nothing away, as we've always said, what Kyrie Irving can do on the court for us. Bottom line, though, man, as we just look through some of these comments here, I was more impressed with what they accomplished tonight than I had. I don't know, man. What is that? They're 2-5, so we got 7 games. I'd say 3 out of 7, I felt like, okay, I can see some things they can work with here. 4 of them, I thought maybe this is dumpster fire and it's just burning a mile high. I'd like to get the consistency, but I'll even focus beyond Kevin Durant and Kyrie. The role players seem to be getting more comfortable in what they need to do, and that matters to having that flow and continuity. It would be much better if Ben had been a part of it.
They just need. I think I'm going to end up saying this 1,000 times over the course of a season. They just need Simmons to play like a not even a $40 million player. They need to play like a $20 million player. Like, because this will always come down to the math. The math on the numbers will not. This is somewhat of a repeat of something we said the other night, but it just bears repeating. The math will never work when you have $40 million wrapped into a guy who plays like something way less than that, because you just simply can't make up the difference. You can't make up the difference on the money and the talent, because money equals talent, and you can't make it. You can't make up the talent level just by the Yuta Watanabe's of the world. As much as we love him, like he's a nice player. Markieff Morris, nice player. All these guys, like they're nice. They're fine. Edmund Sumner, they're nice players. Like they're at the lower end of the salary scale for a reason, and they're just. We were getting, frankly, for like a guy like Yuta, you're getting the most you could have ever dreamed out of him right now. Like, right? Yeah. He's like outplaying his contract. With Simmons has to play up to a certain number in that contract for this all to work. Otherwise, I think it's actually just always going to be a struggle. I think they're going to have struggling keeping all together for, multiple games, even the whole game. I believe it's going to work, and I believe it will happen with him, but he really just is the key. I hate to put so much on him, but it's just truth. It's just truth. Like the numbers just don't work.
By the way, because even just in the simple math of it, take away 35 minutes of the best defensive player on the court and someone that can facilitate offensively and get rebounds for you. The Nets don't have anywhere to go to fill those voids in any type of successful capacity.
This isn't like baseball. This isn't the Yankees where they can just spend up to like a gajillion dollars if they want to do it. And if you make a $15 million mistake, it's like, no, I mean, maybe this is not the best example because they don't do this as much anymore, but like, just think about when they did this forever, when they outspend everybody. You can make a lot of big time mistakes because it just didn't matter. You can keep spending.
Some would argue maybe the Nets have made big time mistakes.
It just doesn't work. It doesn't work in basketball. You can't make mistakes. Like you can't make mistakes at the top end of the pay scale because you just won't ever be able to make them up. And that's really why Simmons is the key.
By the way, I'll sidebar something here before I touch on a very important comment that we got here in the chat. But
about my hair.
But then we'll see if it comes up organically in the conversation. But there is the NBA was like proposing setting a hard cap on how deep into luxury tax teams can go. Something that the NBA PA is going to push back hard against because it means there won't be as many dollars to spend. But in theory, like this is just a sidebar. Like I found that interesting, and I personally would prefer it. It's ironic being a guy that covers the Nets who spent well into the luxury tax, but I would prefer it because then it ideally keeps superstar talent longer on their current teams. It keeps a little bit more balance and a little bit more parity around the league. Just as you were mentioning, how much you can go ahead and spend to solve some of these problems. But just real quick here, this one's a big one. Now he says he's joking. I don't know for sure, but hey, listen, guys, when it works for you, it works for you. And the worst part about having a good head hair, I will say, because just to
tell me about the worst part.
Yeah, let me tell you the worst part about it. What I will say is when we come into the shows, I am envious of Doug, and I'm being 100% honest. That when he comes in, it's nice and clean, like he's clean, polished, ready to go. And I sometimes show up, and depending on how much prep time I took, if I was vamping a little bit in front of the mirror, I lose track of whether or not I've actually combed this mop of hair. Though I am appreciative of it, and I always knock on wood. And I take
that I'm well past it at this point.
Yeah. So, you're not getting. Yeah, this isn't. Hey, Doug, I got some breaking news, man.
You're like, on what? Well, this like real quick. This is nothing basketball related, but I remember like a couple of years ago, my dad's like said something to me. He's like, well, you wouldn't know about that because you're bald. Now, if I showed you a picture of my dad's hair looks like this. Like, so I was like, what?
It's totally in line with your dad.
I was like, what are you talking about? He's I'm not bald. I was like, are you serious? Like, you just did. It's way worse to not know. And so anyway, that's my whole point of that.
Man, my father one time, as we get back into comments, said he saw a photo of himself. He said, hey, who's that bald guy? And someone goes, it's you. He goes, what? Yeah. And found out. So any other questions though we want to talk about here? Somebody said I did see a couple of these that said, someone said, if you were going to make a move, I don't think it matters. You have to have that discussion. Like, who would you trade? And like, who would on the team that you would trade for? But someone else did throw out with a little bit of a chuckle around, putting together Joe Harris into a package to go get player X. Like, I think this is why early days in the season, it's always so important to have patience around what you see over a game 2, 3, or 4 versus what you think this team can be. And that's what we keep leaning back into. Again, Joe Harris is going to have bad matchups defensively. He's going to have off nights offensively. But tonight, and in general, I will say from the backcourt perspective, like he's become more important because he represents the biggest guy in the backcourt that they have on this roster. And you're seeing time and time again where that value is of just being big enough to stay in front of somebody, to play up on a defensive assignment. Used to be he played at the forward position. Now he's in positionless basketball. He's still playing in the backcourt primarily, and that makes all of his matchups a little bit more successful. So guys like that matter. It doesn't mean that the dollars are always going to make sense with what he gets paid, but in the grand scheme of things, as the team gets healthy, you start to see how people slot into their correct roles.
It's funny about him because he's like never going to be a great defender. He's not a terrible defender, right? Like we've seen what looks like Patty Mills is like, this is not about effort either. He's just too small to be a good defender. He's a bad defender. Like that's right. What it is. Harris is athletic enough and big enough to just be able to get in front of enough guys, right? Yep. He's never going to, the Chris Middletons of the world will always torch him. Smaller guards will always torch him, but he's like just enough of everything to be viable. And that's really at this point, based on how well he can shoot threes, he's only shot 2 tonight. Like that is pretty much good enough, I think, for him. Like he's got to play 30 minutes a game at this kind of like sort of what he did tonight, I think, to be like really worth it. What did he play? He played 29 minutes, right? Played 29 minutes. You probably wanted to in this amount of time, wanted to be taking like 4.5 threes a game instead of 2. I think that's like sort of the expectation. It didn't look like a lot of those looks were there. He was making up for it in the defensive end. He was expending a decent amount of defensive effort in this game. And I think that could probably end up becoming part of the, why the shots maybe weren't as robust. But if you're going to get like a plus minutes out of Harris, where he's not shooting a lot of threes, I mean, he's always going to give you something just because the spacing, the threat of the spacing is sometimes good enough. And like, just because you just can't leave that guy. You just can't leave Harris as a defender at all because he's just too good. He's the best 3-point shooter in basketball. So even just the threat of that, the gravity around that will always be worth, I think, a lot, even if it's not showing up in the box score. And then if he's going to turn it into defensive end too, like then he is actually playing like a $20 million a year player, which is right around where he is.
Well, by the way, it's like again, like the contracts, it's all relative, man. We're not making $20 million a year. So sometimes, you compartmentalize.
Can I say something about this? Read this question. Yeah. I actually want to say something about this.
This is from Kevin Hoffman, who says, I still think Simmons will put it together. Got to support him. If we, the fans, can build him up and a potential very high for a team with Harris, Curry, and Mills. And I think he's touching on something that matters here. You do need to support Ben Simmons. Like, and you can judge that however you want. As a fan base, when he does things well, you're going to want to be loud about it. When he maybe makes some mistakes, you're probably going to want to gloss over them early days here. Go ahead.
I think this is so overrated. Maybe it's just me. I'm not a professional athlete. So, okay, I'm going to.
But you just talked about Ben Simmons, though, like, You said the Nets win the game, and does that impact Ben Simmons not being a part of that? So
I think that sorry. I think that the fans have any part in this is so overrated.
Okay.
Like I think the support around this is so overrated. I'm not saying like don't cheer for the guy. But by the way, again, for the 50 millionth time, nobody in the world wants Ben Simmons to be good more than us. Yeah. Because as again, the better Ben Simmons is, the better the podcast does. It's just like 1-to-1, right? Like, so it's a 1-to-1 correlation. So believe me, if you're looking
coach
for
of the year, that's the goal.
You're looking, for this podcast. all of it, just being good is the best thing for a podcast. Anyway, I do think the support thing is just like, I think a lot of this is just on him. I still am very worried, and I don't think it has anything to do with how loud he gets cheered for or any of this other stuff. Like he has a focus on him through media, through things that he did sort of on, because on his own. He got thrown under the bus by Doc for sure. It did not help him. He had some high profile gaffes. Mm-hmm. I was watching him the other night. It was in the cutaway during like the league pass stuff where they show what's happening on the court. Like they'll show you like the halftime stuff and all this stuff. And it was coming out of halftime, and it was when everyone's jacking up shots, right? Because like that's what everyone does. Like, as Patty Mills running around throwing up shots, everyone's just getting loose. And Simmons was standing under the basket, doing nothing. For every 3 shots that Patty Mills would take, because he was the guy that was in the frame. I couldn't see the other guys. Mm-hmm. He was in the frame. I think Seth was there too. And for every 3 shots that Curry was getting up, Simmons was getting up like one, maybe kind of like little floater. And I was thinking,
that could bother me.
I was just kind of like, look, this is not trying to get like aggregated or anything like that. And I'm actually like, this isn't like that, the practice in the park thing where he got the airballed, which is going to like, everyone's going to just absolutely run to Twitter to be able to repost that. But it did make me wonder a little bit about what's happening, because I'm like, this is the thing. Like, these are the things that we always want to see the most of. We want to see the shot improve. We want to see the confidence around the rim improve. We want to see, that he can maybe finish with both hands. Like, it's always confusing about which hand he should actually be shooting with. And it's 3.5 minutes. Is it like a huge deal? Probably not. But I did watch that thinking, this is just not how a lot of these other guys go about this. And like, that does worry me a little bit.
I will say, worry, right? If there's one worry or concern I have, and we've talked about this before, but this in very specific, clear terms. If it turns out that Ben Simmons isn't working on the other things in his game, right? To try to improve the free throw shooting, which we assume he is, to try to improve just some of the little mid-range touch, the floater, which hand am I shooting with, whatever it may be. If it comes to pass that he's not really trying to build up those reps and improve those areas, then you'll see a level of frustration, and it's mostly because for what he needs to be for this team, it's not going to be enough if you are some version of facilitator / rebounder and defensive stopper. It's never going to be fully good enough if you have a timidness about your offensive game. At some point, he needs to play downhill, aggressive basketball. It doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be perfect, but he has to play aggressive offensive basketball. And if there is a correlation between the way he practices around those aspects of his game and the production on the court, then there will be a frustration level. I know that's something that any Phillies fan will be in the chat or comments saying, like, you guys got duped. This is what it is. And if it came to pass, by the way, we're if nothing, if but honest, right? We think he can get there. And if he doesn't, we're going to be the first ones to be critical of him as well.
Like I said, this is a 3-minute thing, but maybe it wasn't even that long, but it did kind of exemplify, I think, what some of the concerns are around him. And it just stood in such sharp contrast to like sort of everything else that was happening on the court around him during that time among his peers, which were all like, even if they weren't going to be playing that much, they were all just like, hey, this is part of the process. Get out there, get shots up, get reps. And he was just like, it was not a get reps situation. Again, I might have just seen the wrong 3 minutes, but it's not like he has this huge history of like improving in any of these areas. If anything, there's been massive regression. So that's my concern.
Quick tapping on Maine. And he hasn't been terrible, but he hasn't been there enough. It's not even about the makes or misses of the line. It's about getting to the line more frequently. I'll run through just a couple more of these, and then we're going to close this one out. So We just, because that's what we're going to do tonight. That's how this one's going to go.
Wait, hold on. Did someone say he hasn't shot terrible? He's 46% from the line. I was just looking. I was like, wait a second. Did I forget this number? He's shooting 47%, career worst from the line this year. So I don't know what that's an incorrect.
I was going to say, because how many has he taken this season?
Not like almost none, but he's taken almost none, and he's taken 15 and he's made 7. He's like made it's his. Yeah. If it continued on, it would be his worst regular season free throw percentage of his career. So I just want to push back.
What's misleading about that? When you think about like, so 15 over what amounts to 6 games, right? So by the average is like when he goes 1 for 3 in a game, you're like, listen, it's not that, like, 1 for 3. But if he got to the line 6 times, like he should be, and he was 1 for 6 or 2 for 6, you know what I mean? Like
it's terrible.
The more attempts you get is the worse that the percentages look. Because I even said that about Claxton at times when he goes, 2 of 5 one game, but 3 of 6 the next. You try to play out to the averages on that. Do the Nets have an issue with the coaching? Why is this team 2-5? Why isn't Ben shooting? Why is the team so inconsistent? We need a strong personality that hold guys accountable. And this is also who took a knock at your head. But I feel like we've covered this over the course of the podcast for the first
let me just roll through. We'll close it on this. I have one more thought on this. I tweeted something about this today. I do think there should be concerns around this also, because the part where the team hasn't played together and the team is like, missing players. Like I went through the teams earlier. Every team has missed guys this year. Like every single team was dealing with some question mark.
The one part you can push back.
Like it's so easy to push back on this because every team has had major issues this year. Not every team. I'm gonna rapid fire. Did I do these the other night or I just do it tweet? I don't think so. No. Okay, so let me just rapid fire through these real quick and then we'll get out of here.
All right.
Bucks, no Middleton all year, 6-0. Cleveland Cavaliers, no Darius Garland all year, got hurt like the first minute of the game. They're 5-1. Celtics, no Robert Williams. He's like a defensive player of the year candidate. Closed the finals last year. They're 5-1. Or excuse me, they're 4-2. Raptors just lost Van Vliet and then just won. They blew out the Hawks without Van Vliet. Hawks, they're a new team, DeJounte Murray, right? So they added a new guy. They're 4-3. Sixers, Embiid hasn't played like 3 games this year, 4-4. The list goes on. So you can see this is just the East.
That was already 6
this
right
is just
there,
the
just
East.
The Eastern Conference. Yeah.
Forget when I go over the West when all these teams that are supposed to be losing are winning, like the Spurs and the Rockets and the Jazz, right? Like these teams,
teams that are just bad and are winning games.
Spurs and Jazz traded all their good players away, essentially, and they're like still winning, right? So I guess I'm agreeing with you took the question down and I don't know who did it, but I'm agreeing with if we're continuing to find issues with the coaching staff, which I think is probably for some people have been the thing they've been talking about for 2 years now, and I don't know, we haven't spent as much time talking about it. You do lose a lot of the goodwill when you just recognize for the coaching staff, when you recognize that every team has problems. I just went through half the teams in the East with major players out, right? Yeah. Like the whole team.
And I'll not push back, but like I can point to a handful. Like Cleveland is a good example because they have a new player, but like the Bucks, the Celtics, teams that have essentially very strong continuity on their rosters, they've been essentially the same. Now you can make the case that the Celtics, who have lost their
new coach
and are flying by the seat of their pants now, like there's also variables to it. There's like some mild push I could put on it. Ultimately, though, I think you're 100% correct, because what it comes down to is, can you make the adjustments? Now, maybe because we're inside of the fishbowl and the James Hardens, the comings and goings, the injuries, the in and out of the lineups, right? All of this stuff, we know what the story has been for the Brooklyn Nets. I sometimes, I think, have a hard time, and maybe this crystallizes around Steve Nash. I don't think he's a particularly good coach. Let me just be clear, right? Because nothing suggests that he's been particularly a good coach. However, by and large, we always say the best players usually win. So then what the question you have to ask is it that Steve Nash is so insanely bad as a coach, which some people think, that he's actively actually dragging this team down, or is it some combination of the players and the product on the court that does not get it together consistently enough, right? Like big scoring performances are great, but if you don't win games, flashy plays are wonderful, but if you don't get the defensive stops when they matter, I have a hard time looking at this game tonight as an example and saying, what was it from a coaching perspective that fell down that the Pacers were able to make a comeback like that and tie it at 100? I didn't identify anything from a coaching standpoint. Guys were there trying to make the plays. The results didn't pan out. And you end up getting the win. So it's hard for me. And I think the easy one to do when we talk about coaching is just looking at some of the best teams in the league the Steve Kerrs, the Nick Nurses, the Greg Popoviches of the world, right? Those are the ones where I think there's this clear delineation of, the high level impact that coach has on that roster. I wonder if we went through the league, how many teams we would point to and say high coaching impact versus all relative to how good the players are and if they win the game.
Yeah, it might be that like guys like Katie and Kyrie aren't the easiest to coach in different systems too. Like I'm not sure, and also like maybe I'll take that back. We saw
because it worked with Kevin Durant and Golden State,
and it worked when they had Harden too. Like when they had Harden, they were going to win the championship. Like that's what was going to happen.
Right,
like
that's it. Right, and there's a good example. Right,
Harden, Kyrie, like we are probably about we're one hamstring and one ankle from Steve Nash probably holding Steve Nash being championship coach, right?
Right.
And so this is why this thing is always really, really hard. And like I agree with you. I think this is the hardest thing to probably quantify for anybody. And I think it's hard for the front office to quantify. I think it's hard for players to quantify. I think it's nearly impossible for fans to quantify. Like I think fans will see wins and losses and just say that's the whole story. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. I've talked to people that have tons more, hashtag watch the tape like background than I do, that have pushed back and said like they are doing certain things that like are good, right? Like if you but it's not like also not overwhelming or anything like that. And there's gonna be guys,
good enough, not terrible.
And those same guys will say that like it'll, there's fundamental build issues, and that's not Nash's fault either.
Right.
Like there's issues that go all the way up to Marks to say like this is just not the right collection of guys, right? And so at that point, like what can be done? I think this is way more nuanced than it is just easy. And I think it's the same thing is why often when fans will watch players, and if a player makes 4 baskets in a row, you're like, you can't believe the guy doesn't get more playing time. And when he misses 4 shots in a row, you can't believe he's still on the court. And like that's also an insanely incorrect overreaction, right? So I'm agreeing with you that it's hard.
Yeah.
I guess I'm only just trying to, when it's hard, you have to just look for ways to compare it. That's all, right? Like
this is all we have. We only have the evidence and the things that we can compare.
And at that point, when you can find lots of examples of, because anytime you want to use an excuse or something like or use something like a heuristic to like try to figure out like what it is, like at that point you can just go around and say, okay, well, is anyone else having the same problems? And you're just like, yeah, well, all teams have problems.
Right. And some teams handle them better than others, right?
Yeah.
So listen, ultimately, we're going to close this one out. As we said, we appreciate everyone that comes in for the live post-game podcast and the little follow-up. Hopefully we got to some of these questions here. We knew we were going to keep it briefer. Keep being here for it. The Nets are going to take on the Chicago Bulls tomorrow. Yep. And we'll be in for that post-game live as well and taking some more of your questions again. So keep supporting us. We'll keep supporting you through the good times and the bad. Am I right, friends? That being the case, this has been another session of Locked On Nets podcast, and we will be back again talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.